Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our EWA webinar today on LGBT stories that reporters should cover after Pride Month. My name is Stacia Cedillo, and I'm a program manager here at EWA. So let me go ahead and hand over the microphone to Evie De Jesus. She's a veteran education reporter who has covered the LGBT community for PennLive.com. Evie is going to be today's moderator, so take it away, Evie.
Thank you so much, Stacia. Hello, everyone. I'm Evie, and I use she, her pronouns. I'd like to welcome everyone, our audience members, as well as our speakers today, including Joseph Cosque, Research Director at GLSEN, Francisco Negron, Chief Legal Officer at the National School Boards Association, and Karen McCarthy, Principal at Guild Elementary School in the Boston Public School Systems. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this important and timely discussion on the media's coverage of the LGBTQ community. As most of you know, we are coming to the end of Pride Month in what is a very interesting national landscape full of contrast. We have the business sides, we have more corporate corporations and companies who are really celebrating and embracing pride in LGBTQ inclusion and equality, not only in marketing, as well as corporate policies and hiring policies, but at the same time, we have more state legislatures across the country than ever before introducing legislation aimed at restricting the rights of the LGBTQ community. We have more than 250 bills aimed at restricting LGBTQ rights and more than 100 bills specifically targeting the transgender community. We just recently saw Florida ratify a law that restricts transgender students' ability to participate in interscholastic sports. We are seeing a growing number of states seeking to block transgender youth from receiving gender-affirming medical care. Montana recently banned upgrades to birth certificates to align with people's gender identity. Tennessee passed a series of anti-trans bills, really kind of allowing businesses to warn, more or less, quote, warn customers that trans people may be using the restroom. So really just seeing a slew of legislation efforts aimed at restricting the rights of the LGBTQ community, in particular the trans community. And many of you know that that's more or less a backlash against the Marriage Equality Act, and in particular, the target has become the trans community. So clearly, we as journalists have a breadth of stories that we should be doing. Most of us are doing. There are things to consider, a lot of sensitivities. Stark reality is that there is no federal law that explicitly protects the LGBTQ community from discrimination. We have some states and some local non-discrimination laws, but really only 18 states that have passed laws to protect the LGBT community. I come to you from Pennsylvania, which is one of 27 states that has no explicit statewide laws protecting people from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity in employment, housing, and public accommodation. So clearly, I find there's just no end to the types of stories that we could be doing. Most of us are keeping tabs on the Equality Act at the federal level, which would be a far-reaching piece of legislation, more or less updating the federal civil rights laws, prohibiting discrimination across the board for members of the LGBT community. So lots there to talk about. I'll give you a really quick, just kind of a get-to-know-me type thing. I have been general assignment enterprise special projects reporter now for more years than I care to think about, but thankfully they've been really great opportunities. And I've over the years have really reported a lot on social issues and the LGBT community in particular, marriage equality, all those other topics that fall under that umbrella. In recent years, I've really have focused on the transgender community because it really has emerged central to this conversation of inclusion and equality. Here in Pennsylvania, as in other states, we have members of the legislature that are trying to push through measures to restrict transgender rights, specifically allowing transgender or prohibiting transgender students from playing in interscholastic sports. Really verbatim laws that a lot of the GOP-led legislatures across the country are either ratifying or seeking to ratify. We have the same here in Pennsylvania. So I've written about LGBTQ, marriage equality, trans issues, and just really finding that the more that I get into these stories, the more I get to know people and meet people, it just sort of exponentially continues to expand in terms of story ideas, as well as sources, as well as my own learning curve. So I'm going to leave it at that as really my opening and turn it over now to Joseph Koskew, Research Director at GLSEN, and then we'll move through the presentation and we'll wrap up in a little while with Q&A. But Joseph, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Evie. It's a pleasure to be here. You can see a PowerPoint slide, I hope, and assume, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, so I was given about 7 minutes to talk about trends and challenges for LGBTQ students in the United States. Sorry, I have to move this control panel because I can't see my slide. And as a researcher, we're long-winded, so I will try my best to be short and sweet. As I said, I'm Joe Koskew. I'm the director of the GLSEN Research Institute. If you aren't familiar with GLSEN, we're a US-based nonprofit and working on LGBTQ plus inclusion and LGBTQ issues in elementary and secondary education. And we're about 30 years old. And for 20 of those years, GLSEN has been doing research because there was believe it or not, early on, 20 years ago, there was very little information about the experiences of LGBTQ secondary school students. So that in part hindered some of the changes that GLSEN advocates are trying to make. So, what I'm going to talk about is from, starting in 1999, GLSEN has been doing a biennial survey of LGBTQ plus secondary school students, so middle school and high school in the United States, asking about their experiences in school with regard to both negative indicators like homophobic remarks, transphobic remarks, gender bias, but also experiences of harassment and assault from peers in school and school-related discrimination. However, we also ask about supports. We ask what are the kinds of supports that you have available to you and what does your school do that's good, that is supportive and affirming for LGBTQ plus students. What we have been seeing, so this chart looks at biased remarks over time, and you can see we sort of add certain things as they become known to us as current expressions. But what we've seen is, in general, there's been a decrease in anti-LGBTQ language from both students and staff. This chart shows frequency from students. And the most common has historically been expressions like "that's so gay," which is often used to indicate something that is not liked, not valued, like, oh, that class was so gay. So meaning something in that regard, followed by other more traditional forms of homophobic remarks. Excuse me. And in general, we've seen decreases. Where we have seen an uptick in recent years actually from 2017 to 2019, is in expressions like "that's so gay," as well as expressions like "no homo," which you would say, if you're complimenting, you want to indicate that your statement is not a sexual advance, like "I really like your shirt," no homo. So what we see is "that's so gay" and "no homo" are actually have increased recently, and our understanding of that is that those are perhaps ways in which homophobia is endemic in the culture, in the schools, and the workaround is students will say, well, I didn't mean it to be homophobic, and yet it still is disturbing and bothersome and adds to a hostile climate for LGBTQ students. When we look at students' experiences, LGBTQ plus students' experiences with harassment and assault over time, we have seen great changes since we first started doing this work in the degree in which students are experiencing verbal harassment, and physical assault because of their sexual orientation and because of their gender expression. So how masculine or feminine they express themselves, traditionally masculine or feminine they express themselves to be. It has, verbal harassment is obviously the most common, which is, as opposed to hearing homophobic remarks or transphobic remarks or gender biased remarks in the hall, which can affect your experiences in school, these are comments that are directed at you as an individual. And you can see they have mostly leveled off in most recent years. And verbal harassment regarding gender expression decreased, but we were a little concerned 2 years ago, well, in 2017, that that there might be an increase in gender bias going on in schools. And with regard to physical harassment and physical assault, you may think, oh, those numbers are small. They have slightly changed over the years. But when you think about the severity of these events, physical harassment would be being pushed or shoved, and physical assault would be kicked, punched, injured with a weapon. These are really serious, severe events that 5 to 10% of students saying that they're experiencing them commonly in school. Speaking, Evie was talking about some of what's been going on recently in the country around transgender issues. Since 2013, we've been asking students, transgender students in our survey about trans-specific or gender-specific discrimination that they've experienced. Specifically, have you been prevented from using a bathroom or locker room that aligns with your gender identity? Prevented from using your own chosen name or pronouns, and prevented from wearing clothes that may be deemed inappropriate for your gender. And what you can see is the most common and unchanged is being prevented from using the bathroom or locker room that aligns with one's gender identity. We've seen some decreases in the other two forms over the years, and we believe some of that is about enforcement of dress code or enforcement of what name or pronoun you use is at the teacher level, and I think we've seen increases in teachers' awareness and support over the years. But access to facilities is an institutional factor, so at the level of the school leadership, the principal, or the school district. And I'm concerned what we would see. We're collecting our 2021 data right now. What we will see, even as schools were sort of crazy this past year and across the country, whether what we will see in terms of that, because what we see is public opinion and public debate encroaching into the experiences of students in schools. Just a quick note, we ask students, youth of color, about hearing racist remarks and racist harassment in school. And what we found is harassment has been slightly decreasing over the years, but racist remarks have increased. And I think we believe that's somewhat similar to what we're seeing with "that's so gay" or "no homo." But with the advent of bullying policies, I think students know, okay, I can't beat someone up for this reason, but I can perhaps still make racist comments in school. Like, that's not hurting anybody, but because we see that as well. Another thing in recent years is really looking at, we ask students who weren't born in the US about their citizenship, feeling unsafe because of citizenship status. And we've seen this chart, the top line is undocumented residents. And you can see a huge increase, statistically so huge that we had to triple check it to make sure it was accurate, in that students are feeling much more unsafe in school because of their immigration status in this country. So I will just quickly say that we've seen some great gains in some of the supports in school. We continue to see increases in the number of supportive educators that there are, and we continue to see great gains in the number of students who say they have student clubs that are supportive, gay straight alliances, gender sexuality alliances. What we're not seeing are a lot of changes around inclusive curriculum and policies that protect LGBTQ students from bullying and harassment. And I think those are still areas that are important and really hard to move in schools today. I'll just leave you with a teaser that if you go to the glisten.org/NSCS or /research, you can look at the full report. We do a little thing about when identity terms have emerged and changed over time, because I think identities are continually emerging under our youth. And I know many of you in the audience are interested in state-specific information, and I encourage you to go to glisten.org/state snapshots, where we have short 2-page snapshots that have some basic information about the experiences of LGBTQ students in I think 40 of the 50 states and not DC. So thank you very much for that. And I will try to figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
Slides. Thank you. Thank you, Joseph. We now welcome Francisco Negron, who is the Chief Legal Officer for the National School Boards Association. Hi, Francisco.
Hi, Evie. Thank you. And thank you, everybody. I don't have a presentation, but I'd just like to touch on some of the legal issues that public schools are facing in the area of gender identity. And I think one of the most significant things that has happened in this area of the law is last summer's really seminal decision or landmark decision in the Bostock cases. And if you haven't been following those cases dealt with employment and discrimination under the federal law that prohibits discrimination in employment, Title VII, which includes a prohibition against discrimination on the basis of sex. And in particular, those cases involve two employees, two plaintiffs who were discriminated against on the basis of sexual orientation, and one individual who was discriminated against on the basis of her gender identity in the employment arena. And the Supreme Court said unequivocally in an opinion written by Justice Gorsuch that sex under Title VII includes sexual orientation and gender identity, saying, and the quote is something like, because of sex means sexual orientation and gender identity, full stop, and then giving sort of a whole litany of reiterations of that same statement. So it's clear now, at least, that when it comes to the employment world, that is the state of the law by a supermajority on the Supreme Court, a 6-3 decision in that case. So it's not going away anytime soon. But the important thing for us in the educational world is that as goes Title VII, goes Title IX, which is sort of the equivalent version, or at least the piece of legislation in the world of schools and education that forbids discrimination on the basis of sex. One court, at least the 11th Circuit, has held exactly what I just said, which is as goes Title VII, goes Title IX. And so we conclude that discrimination on the basis of gender identity, in one case coming out of Florida involving the use of restrooms by a transgender student, constituted discrimination under Title IX. That case has not been overturned. It was petitioned for rehearing back in December by the full court, but the court has not moved in that direction. Of course, previous to that, I think the case that really brought everything to light in terms of sort of the federal circuit courts of appeal was the 4th Circuit case involving Gavin Grimm out of the state of Virginia. He was a transgender boy. Now a transgender man, has graduated from high school, but at the time he also was compelled to use either a single-sex bathroom but forbidden to use the boys' restroom. And the 4th Circuit ruled in his favor primarily on equal protection grounds. So I think the state of the law is becoming more and more clear. I should mention that in the Gavin Grimm case, that case was just yesterday, I believe, denied cert by the United States Supreme Court, which means that they refused to take that case under consideration and to hear it. So the Fourth Circuit's ruling still stands. And somebody asked me, well, what does that mean? As a former law professor of mine used to say, well, cert denied just means cert denied. It doesn't mean anything else. We shouldn't infer anything in terms of what they intend to do in the future around this. Perhaps, I think what it does say, at least for now, is that the court is definitely in a posture of letting these cases continue to percolate through the appellate courts and to see how many of those appellate courts apply their ruling in Bostock in a similar fashion. Of course, that means that the battle is now shifting towards the states when these kinds of issues, constitutional issues, issues of competing constitutional questions are resolved on one level by federal laws or a national federal decision like this, then we see the battles turning to the states. And so we have sort of a plethora of states, I think at last count at least 30 states, either had passed or were considering some form of legislation forbidding the competition of transgender students in sports, whether at the secondary level or at the post-secondary level, in sports that with which their gender identity aligns, so that trans girls, for instance, would be forbidden from participating in traditional girls' sports. And that tends to be, by the way, what we see in most of these laws. They tend to be directed specifically at the participation of transgender girls in girls' athletics. One of the states where this has recently arisen is in the state of West Virginia with House Bill 3293 EV right next door to Pennsylvania, so not far from you. And that's a case involving an 11-year-old trans girl by the name of initials BPJ. And unfortunate, because from now on I will always have to stop and pause for fear of calling her PBJ. But BPJ versus West Virginia Board of Education and the Harrison County School Board, school officials and the like, because that state passed this law that, of course, restricted and prohibited the participation of transgender girls in girls or transgender women in participation in women's athletics, at the K-12 level, but also in interscholastic athletics at the state level. Interestingly enough, this 11-year-old girl brought suit in federal court, assisted by the ACLU, but also by the U.S. Department of Justice, with the Department of Justice actually filing a statement of interest that I think is very helpful, citing to the cases that I mentioned, including Bostock. What I think the courts are doing in this case is they're looking at, or at least what we see as the two sides of this issue and how it's being positioned, is that states or legislatures that are moving forward with laws that ban the participation of transgender students, transgender girls primarily in girls' sports, they're relying on what they see as a discriminatory aspect based on biological sex. So that's the class of students with which they're comparing transgender girls, and basically suggesting that the transgender girls are really cisgender boys, that it's really that these transgender girls are really boys, and so they're competing in with the class of girls. So seeking to make that kind of distinction, and that's the kind of argument that they present, notwithstanding that, and raising issues of fairness and athletic ability and the like, notwithstanding the fact that there's lots of evidence, and I think Joseph could probably speak more to that, that the competitive elements there just simply haven't haven't borne out to be true, and the science hasn't either. And so what you see on the other side with, for instance, the plaintiff in that particular case, the 11-year-old trans girl, and assisted by the Department of Justice and the Biden administration, is the view that the class is really based on your gender identity, so that a transgender girl should be compared not, should not be lumped in with cisgender boys, but really with other girls. And that's the class being treated discriminately vis-a-vis other girls. And that's the class. So that's part of the distinction that needs to be made. I think for the most part, if I'm predicting where courts are going to go with this, I think there's going to be a heavy road to sow for the legislatures in the states that are moving forward with these prohibitions, in part because they've got to show some sort of rational connection, some sort of reasonable government interest in moving for this prohibition. And they've got to show that there's some, definite sort of inequality or unfairness, and then identify how that is some sort of rational state purpose that they're seeking to achieve. And that, I think, is going to be somewhat of a challenge for them, especially when sex has already been ruled by the Supreme Court to be covered under Title IX. So given that definitional piece, then this is going to be subject to intermediate scrutiny, which is sort of that middle tier of scrutiny. And I think they're going to ultimately have a hard road to sow. But that doesn't mean that the cases are over, because when a lot of these assertions, when they're brought by individual plaintiffs or families, like let's say perhaps a cisgender girl, like they did in Connecticut, they'll assert their own equal protection violations. Sometimes they'll assert sincerely held religious beliefs that has to do, of course, with the First Amendment and free exercise concerns. So then it becomes a battle of whose equal protection survives, right? So then that question is one that ultimately the courts can resolve. If we were to guess, we would think that the Bostock decisions are instructive on this. The Bostock decision is instructive on this, but we've yet to see. And then just one last point, particularly for schools, and I think for education writers, that an angle that's often not addressed or explored by reporters, because they're focused, rightfully so, on the children involved and those implications. But an important aspect is really, what are schools to do with this, right? Because you have competing statutory and constitutional mandates. Keep in mind that schools are purely creatures of state law. And so in many instances, their first order of business is to follow state law. And here you have an express prohibition, right, from state law. But aside from just, a matter of state law and deciding to break state law, you have a law like the one in West Virginia that actually says that there is a private right of action by those cisgender students who assert discrimination. So they could, if a school like Harrison County decided not to follow that law, those parents or those families of cisgender students feeling discriminated against could bring that action in court with full fees and costs and damages. So it's almost in many ways an invitation with the creation of the private right of action for litigation, which of course is not something that schools like to engage in. Those are general revenue dollars. They come straight out of the classroom in most instances, and that's not a place that's good for schools, and do they relish being in that. On the other hand, they have the federal government, right, very clearly saying, this is our interpretation about Title IX. They've withdrawn all of the statements of interest and opposite views that the previous administration had filed in several court cases. They've issued their own statement and filed their statements of interest, which clearly say that in their opinion, Title IX includes protections for transgender children, transgender athletes, which means that they have equal rights to participate in the sport with which their gender is aligned. And the issue for schools there is, so if they don't follow that as federal fund recipients, do they stand to lose any of those dollars? dollars have never really been withheld historically, but it is a real possibility. But also another real possibility is facing an enforcement action by the Office of Civil Rights. So really, this is what I think is a fascinating story that as a writer you might be interested in, is how does the school navigate that, right? How do they thread that needle of making sure students feel included? Because we know that students that are transgender and are excluded, and feel ostracized, that can have an impact on their learning and a terrible sort of personal impact on students. And in an era where schools are trying to address questions of bullying and harassment, these are very real concerns. On the other hand, they have a responsibility to follow the law and be appropriate stewards of the taxpayer dollars entrusted to them. So it's really, I think, a classic catch-22 situation, even in this area of a shift in the perspective of the federal administration. So I think I'll stop there and send it back to you, Evie.
Thank you, Francisco. We now will hear from Karen McCarthy. Karen is principal at Guild Elementary School for the Boston Public Schools.
Thank you. I am the principal of an elementary school in Boston. My pronouns are she, her. I'm going to talk a bit about the Welcoming Schools program from the Human Rights Campaign, which helps elementary schools create a welcoming and inclusive environment for LGBTQ plus children, staff, and families. I'll share a bit about our school, our processes, and the program's impact, and then I'm happy to answer any questions or have a discussion about how this fits into our larger topic and your work. So I am the principal of an elementary school of just under 300 students in Boston. While my school, like most of Boston, is in a gentrifying community, it remains primarily a Latinx community with some families who've lived in the neighborhood for generations and are largely Italian American. Our student body is 80% newer immigrants from Central and South America. An increasing number of our students also now come from Northern Africa and the Middle East and speak Arabic. And our poverty numbers are estimated to be about 90%. We speak many languages, we practice different religions, we come from different countries of origin. We're an inclusion school, which means that students with special needs are integrated into our classrooms. And of course, we have different family structures. So I'd been a principal at my school for about 3 years before we formed this partnership with the Human Rights Committee, the HRC, which is a large, I think you're aware of it, advocacy group, anti-discrimination group for LGBTQ plus people. And I discovered the Welcoming Schools, which is one of their programs, through a call to our district's equity office, where I reached my colleague, Stephen. Stephen is the person principals call when we have an incident connected to bias or a protected class, and he's amazing. Everyone needs a Stephen. He's also a Welcoming Schools trainer. In this situation, I called him because I had 2 second graders who were both of color who were using the word dirty to put down each other's brown skin. I told Stephen, while I felt that I could handle these as individual incidents responsibly, respectfully, and thoughtfully, I was concerned about my school culture. Second graders are 7. They enter the school year 7 years old, and they bring to school all they hear about the world. Messages about what is good or bad or better, messages about what is normal and valued, and in this remark, all of that was there. Ideas about difference start early. In addition, I worried about the students' understanding of the words they used in this and other situations and how they felt hearing and using these types of words. I wondered how the students around them felt, and I worried that these kinds of incidents would continue without more intentional school-wide approach. This ultimately led to a discussion of the Welcoming Schools approach and our adoption of this program. Because the heart of this program, the heart is about diversity and providing opportunities for all students to see themselves and their families in the community and to celebrate what everyone brings. And through it, we went on to have a framework, resources, and support to guide our efforts to create an affirming school using a lens of gender, LGBTQ, and other forms of inclusion. This was a multi-year process. It needs to be to deepen and build roots. It's intentional. When you do things quickly in education, they often don't stick. This is adaptive work and it takes time. It also requires clear and honest communication and a deep belief in what you're doing. Before we began, I brought the program to my parent and governing councils. I used materials from the Welcoming Schools program and explained that this would take up a good amount of our teachers' professional development time, as well as my deep belief that children learn better when they can be who they are in school. I spoke to a diverse group: Spanish-speaking immigrants, Arabic-speaking mothers wearing the hijab, young urban professionals whose backgrounds were completely different from those of most of our students, and whose own school experiences were very different from what their own children would experience in mine. I spoke about the diversity throughout our school and went through the training we would experience, and I talked about how this type of work lays the foundation for a healthy school culture. They agreed, and they supported it. Staff went through professional development on seeing and embracing all families. I will put in the chat lesson plans as well, addressing bias-based bullying, understanding terminology around gender. We learned about law and policies at federal, state, and the district level, about creating safe schools and policies for non-binary and trans children, and about making the work intersectional. First, we addressed policies. Simpler technical changes were done. We changed the language on our forms from mother and father to guardian. We made our adult bathrooms gender neutral and had a policy for students to use the bathroom with which they identified. We stopped putting children in boys and girls lines. In any school, the most essential work is done by teachers. To build a welcoming culture, the teachers need to own and drive this work. To bring it into classrooms, we created a committee of teacher leaders who supported their colleagues across our school in developing the Welcoming Schools lessons, which you should have in the chat now, and access to their greater website, which is open source and wonderful. We created a folder in our drive with resources. Teachers modeled lessons for their colleagues and supported across the school. Now, having these lessons was an essential way to get the program to the students very directly. And it took root. Staff dressed up as characters from the Welcoming Schools curriculum for our annual book character day. We agreed on expectations in the school, how every teacher, including art, music, PE, would teach these lessons and engage in this work, because we wanted every student to see every adult furthering it. We also supported staff to build their own Welcoming Schools libraries. We're a K-6 school now. We were K-5 at the time, so different books for different grades, and even built in student leadership by putting a student in charge of our Welcoming Schools school library, which is in our lobby. Importantly, we also brought our work beyond the classroom to families. This is intentional. They're part of the process. We used our spring open house to feature student work from lessons, and we did Welcoming Schools lessons with families. Now, every spring we highlight this and other work. Years went by, we had professional development, we had a leadership team, we had every single staff member involved, families were included, we had technical assistance from Welcoming Schools trainers. Then, a bit after 3 years, we earned what is called a Seal of Excellence, which simply shows we'd met benchmarks in the Welcoming Schools approach. And you can find all of this on the website, and I'm happy to talk more about that. We celebrated. I gave a speech at an event. It was attended by the superintendent, local city representatives, parents, community members, and the mayor. And why did they all come out? Because as progressive as Boston is, this is still a bit unique, and we are one of the first schools to move firmly into this space. At the ceremony, I referred to a speech of Oprah's in which she said that one of the biggest pains in life is to be invisible. She said, we all want the same thing, to know that we matter. We want validation, we want safety, we want love. And I spoke about how the prior weekend, some of us from our school had the privilege to march in Boston's Pride Parade. And as I walked, my favorite sign said, I love you just the way you are. This process through Welcoming Schools was an explicit way to say to everyone in our community that we love our students and our community just the way they are. And we do understand this is a continuous process. For example, this year during a school assembly, we participated in the I Am Jazz National Day of Reading. I Am Jazz is a sweet, simple children's book about a transgender child. After we had a family newer to our school express concern about the topic and asked to opt out of such topics in the future. We met with them as a small team, we listened, we cleared up any misconceptions, explaining that the story is simply about a child who discovers she is transgender and is loved and accepted by her parents. The meeting went well. We explained that we do not opt out, and we shared some statistics and the idea of windows and mirrors in our curriculum. Windows for children into other people's experiences and mirrors to see themselves reflected in it. The teachers sent home books from the Welcoming Schools lessons so those parents could understand how we approach topics of diversity and inclusion. And we kept the door open for future conversations. To conclude, if there's any advice I could give you about covering these topics, simply from my perspective as a principal who works with young people who are developing their ideas and their sense of the world and themselves and others, it's to be aware of what the writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls the single story. You turn to the news today and you see stories, and children see stories of adults arguing over the humanity of trans children, of whether they're mentally ill or subject to child abuse, of whether their presence doing typical activities such as sports is harmful to their peers. I pick up my 13-year-old daughter's TikTok and scroll, and it's replete with stories of harm and bigotry and anxiety for this community. And I think, this is not the entirety of this community. Now, I know that these stories are important and they should and they need to be covered, but I urge you to also show LGBTQ plus people, including young people living like their peers, to show positive stories, stories of acceptance of LGBTQ plus young people with typical feelings and experiences who live and love and have common problems and celebrations. They need to see LGBTQ, and we, cisgendered people that are not in the community, need to see LGBTQ plus people who are accepted. I urge you to also show that. And I'm happy to answer any questions about my experience doing this work in an elementary school, and I'm happy to talk after as well and to share my contact information.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, you make a really interesting point. And I feel it's one of my challenges as a journalist, which is to shed light on marginalized communities and marginalized people, and do it in such a way that it highlights their own challenges, but at the same time also just sometimes do stories that are inclusive of them as just members of our community and not just somebody who needs to be spotlighted for their sexual and gender identity. So it's a bit of a give and take on the part of journalists. Thank you so much. I wanted to share a really quick story. This morning, interestingly enough, several members of the Pennsylvania Senate Democratic, one of the committees, held a hearing on transgender issues. And one of the senators shared her experience this morning. She dropped off her son at lacrosse camp, and she lives outside Philadelphia. She walks him up to the camp, and the first thing the coach says to her is, does he want to play with the boys or girls? So she was really taken back because that was the first time that, she wasn't expecting this from that coach, but she took it as a sign that we are making some progress, that especially in a state like Pennsylvania, which, clearly we have urban and suburban areas that tend to be very progressive. The rest of the state is very, very conservative, very religious conservative, but we still have some breakthroughs. And I'll add to that one of the stories that one of the young people who I interviewed for a recent story I did, she said that for years and years, she was going to school, she's transgender, no one had any problems with it. And then suddenly it was the parents who went to the school board meeting, and they're the ones who began to object to, whatever her expectations and demands were. But for the longest time, her classmates and her friends didn't have any problem with it. So she shared that story that, oftentimes it's coming from other levels, not at the school level necessarily, but, certainly parents and the community. So, do we have questions from, Stacia, do we have questions from the audience?
Yeah, let me pop back on here. And we do have one question. And just a reminder for those that are in the audience, you can submit your questions now. I'm reviewing those here, but we only have one so far, and that's from Catherine Gewirtz, who is at Education Week. Catherine says, it seems like a lot of the attention when it comes to LGBTQ issues, youth issues in particular, are around state laws and court rulings, and a lot of this focuses on bathroom and sports access. So her question for the panelists is, do you all see any additional dynamics that are at work in schools that are affecting LGBTQ students and their experiences? So, in terms of the support they get or curriculum Anything you can think of.
I real quick answer to that. I recently came across I find a stunning statistic. 75% of all gender expansive youth report feeling unsafe in school. And clearly legislation, public policy gets a lot of attention from the media. But yeah, there definitely are stories, very intimate and personal stories of students, also of families, who are grappling with these issues, issues of their children, coming out as trans. And I've spoken to family members who are, I'll say, very conservative, religious conservatives, who literally overnight are having to face this, the situation where a grandmother still loves her grandchild whom she has known as her grandson, and suddenly that grandson says, no, I'm a girl. So how does that family, what happens to that family dynamic, and the growing pains that families go through? So yeah, a lot of personal stories. I hear a lot of people talk about the mental and the physical well-being of students. Healthcare is critical, and then a lot of, again, going back to public policy, a lot of legislatures are trying to make really restrictive public health policies that would restrict gender-affirming healthcare access to students, particularly in states that have large rural areas where you see students, you see young people who live in farm country, and it's different from a child who might live in Philadelphia or Boston, who might be able to, there's a clinic or there's some kind of social service support. If you live in farm country and you're surrounded by, cow farms or chicken farms, and you have very not welcoming parents, you're really facing a dilemma of how do you get to the doctors, how do you get to a clinic to get the health care that you need? So yeah, it's definitely a challenge to move beyond.
I mean, I would just add that from my I've been around this issue in GLSEN for a while, and I mean, I think we see a lot of coalescing around this issue around trans school access, and access to education is a fundamental issue in school facilities. But it's also, that's now. I mean, I think that we had huge battles several years ago about abstinence-only education. I think we had huge battles around self-expression and whether students could wear rainbow flag t-shirts or things like that in school. So none of these things, some things ebb and flow, and I think there's something about probably what was going on either at the government level or around sort of in public opinion and media over the last 2 years around trans access and rescinding sort of the protections that the Department of Education had, the guidance for around trans student protections. There's something that's going on now that is, I think there's traction. And so I'm not a politician, nor do I know policy well. Francisco could probably talk about this better, but I think that's what is, that we see that because there's traction, but we've seen these episodes of moments where this is the thing. It was abstinence only education where we were struggling for and things like that. The one thing I just wanted to also highlight, and then I'll be quiet, is I think it's really to add to sort of stories that I think can be told and need to be told, is really about parent advocacy. I heard that both from Karen and from Evie, that the role of parents in schools and what they're doing to create better and safer schools for their children, for many reasons, but also for LGBTQ children, is I think incredibly compelling and needs to be told, and hopefully will sort of promote more people being inspired to do advocacy. And I was a school counselor in a former life before I was a researcher, and from my vantage point, parents have a lot of they have a lot of power in what happens inside that school. So I think that that's an important story to be told as well.
Yeah, you're right. I remember a few years ago doing stories left and right on schools that were banning gay alliances, and that was at the time kind of the hot topic.
Right.
And you're right. You know, there's this trajectory where we move from one topic to the next, and especially as we sort of the barriers come down. So now almost every school has a gay lesbian alliance. So yeah, clearly now the topic is you know, the sports issue, especially as it impacts trans girls. I've heard a lot about the one topic that we haven't, I don't think we've written very much on as media, the challenges that young people face in changing their names, the legal hassle, the legal challenges that a young person in any given state faces, the expense, the hassle, the intimidation of that process of, you know, changing their names to their gender affirming choice of name. So I think that's a fascinating story.
Karen, I am curious, you know, I like this idea of covering, you know, parents who are actually strong advocates for their children and maybe and for the children of others. I feel like we get a lot of stories covering, you know, protests and parents who aren't comfortable. That gets a lot of media attention. And so I'm kind of curious about your experience as a principal. Do you all have, like, how do you handle a parent that, you know, expresses some, you know, a desire to opt out or just, you know, hesitancy? Do you all have a policy? Because it sounds like there's, you know, this is a really robust program. So could you speak a little bit to like parent policies that you have?
Yeah. And I do want to say we have parents who are awesome mama bears for their kids too, right? And I think, you know, as was mentioned before, that should be shared too. You know, when this was, the incident I mentioned was the only incident that happened. And interestingly, I called my boss the day before and I said, hey, just giving you a heads up, I'm doing this. And he said, well, your school's done so much work, I'm not worried. And the family were newer to the school and hadn't been on the journey with us and had come from a more conservative state. And I thought about it, and the teacher, who's one of my, I have great teachers. She's an outstanding teacher. And she was like, people look at the principal, and sure, I could go to the district, and I did let them know. And I feel very fortunate. I work in Boston. We have an amazing people in central office who support this work. So I felt supported, but I thought to myself, interestingly, I had read a news story, I don't know, a month prior maybe, or earlier that month, about a school that was letting families opt out of Black History Month lessons. And I would come home enraged and just rant to my husband about what is all the implications of that, and what is the subtext of that, what are kids learning. And so when this came up, that was still very close to the surface for me. And I thought I had to make the decision in a way, right? It's a big district, it's a city, and I have some autonomy that way. I knew I'd be supported, and I thought, how is this any different? Like, how is this any different? What does that say? If you can opt out of learning about other people. And I think the best thing was, most people in the world are good. Most people in the world are like the people on this panel. They care about children. And part of it is, how do you have that conversation with families so you don't alienate people that you know there's something inside them that loves their own children. And so I think the simplest and best thing I did was, first they asked about, you know, we don't want to learn about sex. And I said, of course not. Like, this isn't sex ed. This isn't about sex. It's about identity and about diversity. And we want our children to go out in a diverse world and be and thrive. And so, and I think just the book we read was about a girl who discovers she's trans and is unconditionally loved and accepted by her parents. And we asked what was the concern, and there really wasn't one then. I'm not saying there weren't concerns or things going on in them, but you know, you have a conversation, you listen, you assuage fears. This is how I handle it myself. And we did, of course, share some very disturbing statistics because not everyone knows them. And we talked about windows and mirrors. And most of all, I think making it really transparent. What's good about welcoming schools is this curriculum is vetted. You know, I mean, you read stories about penguins, true stories about 2 male penguins who adopted a baby. You read about a crayon. This is a great story. I encourage you all to read the story Red. A crayon with a wrapper that doesn't match the color of the crayon. And it's a beautiful story, and I won't spoil it all, but in the end, that is a metaphor that so many kids feel. There are kids in our community who are probably basketball players and their parents want them to be baseball players, right? There is this humanity at the core of this work, which is what my hope is that's where we can start bringing along the people who, in my opinion, are fed misinformation and fear tactics, largely for political gain. And you could tap into that goodness and you could make it transparent. You don't hide anything, you do it openly and you talk. But we do not opt out in my school. And I would encourage people not to opt out, but to keep that door open for a conversation.
Very interesting.
Okay.
So I think we have time for one more question. And here's one about terminology and reporting. So for reporters who are nervous about following, correct language, what resources do you all have resources to recommend, or anything in particular that reporters should avoid when they are, language-wise, I guess, reporting using, correct terminology? Do you all have any advice?
I put something in the chat that may be a good start. I just put a link in the chat.
I can share that. Thank you.
Stacia, I'll share sort of my own personal experience, which has been increasingly over the recent years as I write more and more about trans issues, is really being honest with people, being really authentic and being really honest. I count myself lucky that I feel like I'm coming from work experience, background experience, where I have more of a command of, vocabulary and sensitivities and whatnot to the LGBTQ community. But I work with people who don't have that, who aren't coming from that perspective, and who feel kind of really intimidated by, being thrown out a story that has them negotiating terms and things that they may not have ever done it. But I just think, and I've actually been told by transgender people who have told me, just be really honest and be yourself and be authentic. And I would not interview anyone from the highest office to someone in prison where I would be disrespectful to them. As a journalist, I want to hear stories and tell their stories and tell the truth. And so it's just really how you go about, meeting with people in their space. And if you have a question, if I have a question, hey, I'll just ask. And also, realize that, there perhaps are questions that you wouldn't ask anyone. So why would you ask a transgender person a question that you may not ask a cisgender person? So I think that, it's all for all of us. I think we do it together. We just walk down this path together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great reporting advice. We are actually at the end of the hour, so that flew by. Thank you to all of our speakers today for presenting on your topics. I feel like this was really informative. Just a reminder, we did record this and we will have it posted on our website within the next 24 to 48 hours. I also want to thank our moderator, Evie, and thank you so much for sharing so much good reporting advice.
Thank you.
Again, as the webinar closes, once you exit, you will get a feedback survey, and we really hope that you will complete it for us. We also have a box on there for webinar suggestions. So if you want to see something in EWA's future and on our webinar schedule, please let us know. So I'm going to end it there. Thanks again to all of our speakers and to everyone who attended. Take care. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.